will open up for discussion. I just like to use my privileged position as moderator to make one or two comments. But very many thanks. One comment to John Palazzo. Is he here?
He's here.
No,
He's hiding.
Oh, you are there. Yeah. I was very interested in what you said about the spoken word being most central to anthropologists. You said what anthropologists most do is talk, and you underscored that. I would like to disagree with you, if all right. I have done lengthy fieldwork in 5 locations, in Egypt and in Oman, in Arabia, and in Bali, and in Bhutan, and in Scandinavia. And it is true that in some places, like I would say, like in Egypt, talk fills the day, and you can't. You just want you wish for silence. But my PhD was on Oman, which is a completely silent community, and people who live, foreigners who come to southern Arabia, say the same. They learn. You stop talking because silence is gold. So you don't get the spoken word. And this stood me in very good stead when I then came to Bali, where it was so important to pay attention to the non-spoken language, what was being communicated. And this has also to do with intersubjectivity, as I now understand it. What was being communicated tacitly and through gestures, and so I would, I would underscore, I would just remind us that people are very, very, very different regarding the emphasis that is put on talk. I would also like to remind us that not just is tacit knowledge important, but that we have to pay attention to what is unspoken and unspeakable in places too. Like my work in Europe, where there are codes of silence in communities, things that cannot be spoken, but that you need to try to investigate even so. Well, I would also like to mention the fact that gender, my God, we have hardly spoken about gender. I happen to be an anthropologist who is married to an anthropologist. I had done, and he had done, we had done fieldwork, each of us separately before we ever got together 35 years ago. But having been in the field with a male, and a male who is older than me, I have come to realize how immensely important gender is in regard to talk many places. Like in Bali, my God, did anyone take me seriously? I was a woman, he was a man. And even he's a very good, I should mention his name is Frederick Barth. He's a very good observer in the field. But his problems sometimes were that he wasn't able just to sit and observe because people wanted to talk to him because he was a man. And whereas I didn't come. So the importance of the spoken word of talk, varies dependent on several things. There was something else I was going to say, but I forgot it, and that's good for you. So you please, yes.
A very obvious nagging question about interdisciplinarity, especially with regards to other ethnographic disciplines, is that aren't we just afraid of not being taken seriously in some ways?
By whom?
By
whom?
By our colleagues, by people with whom we work, by governments. by our students, by our peers, by our families, funding agencies, obviously.
Because we are afraid, we do what?
In talking about intersubjectivity, we frame it in a way that connects to different things, but we certainly don't want to make it warm and fuzzy. We certainly don't want it to be too simple. We talk about confrontation and such, but we talk about something that is fundamental in our work at the same time that is hard to explain to someone who has never done ethnographic fieldwork, or somebody who has done another type of ethnographic fieldwork, for instance, in folkloristics or ethnomusicology or ethnohistory or all of those other ethnographic disciplines. And that we don't need to explain what it is amongst ourselves, but at the same time, we want to have the credibility and the prestige of being able to talk about those things.
Well, I use it quite a bit actually to be taken seriously. It works very well that way as long as you limit it to the notion that social research involves the social researcher and it has to be part of the day-to-day analysis, etc. It works.
Does anyone on the panel want to make a comment to the question about if we use intersubjectivity to make a place for ourselves, to convince others and us that we are significant?
I really did not have to worry about it because I knew that what I was doing was important and it will be taken seriously. So that was not an issue for me.
Again, I comment, just as I was leaving Norway, I think it was 10 days ago, and then there came a notice on the internet that a course would be given on ethnographic fieldwork, the multi-sited experience by George Marcus at the University of Oslo. So I thought, a PhD course, I thought fabulous, great, something going to happen. And it was a whole week-long course on ethnographic fieldwork. It turned out that it was not in the anthropology department. It was the sociology department. And some anthropologists were very angry because they felt that the sociologists had taken over the thing. But we found what I could, so I'm mentioning this because it indicates that there are other disciplines other than anthropology that are now saying they are doing ethnographic fieldwork. So maybe when we say intersubjectivity, we are saying, well, but we are doing something special.
Sociology is a very long tradition of ethnography. Yeah.
But they call it ethnographic fieldwork
In the States they do, yeah.
Well, back home,
what's the difference in it? What's the difference in it?
One of the aspects of the connection we sense and we want to build with our informants, which is solidarity at some level, perhaps mutuality of, trust, moral mutuality, has led to a certain impasse that I think Eric, in a wonderful paper and comments, illustrated, and that comes up with regard to our ethical review process. Many people will apply now because we have these interdisciplinary committees, and the students in particular will say, I commit myself to do this and to do this and this. I'll destroy my data after 2 years. We have to say, stop. No. But one thing they often say is, I will commit myself to return my data to the informants and get their permission to use this or that. We say, no. That gives them, first of all, too much power, if there be power back and forth. But it sets up a sort of a confrontation where, in fact, then they are the censors. And any anthropology, any kind of social sciences should be sort of have an aspect of critical dimension and hard-hitting. You've got to dig deeply into something, and it's never going to please all the people you dealt with.
It starts with vastly overestimating the importance of what you did.
Well, that's a point too. But the minute you give them back something and an analysis, they can say, "Well, did he really get it right?" But it seemed to me, Eric, that your situation with the person in Monticello set up that situation. And you have now a bit of a predicament, but you've already, I guess, decided what to do. You're going to publish it and be damned. But that obviously now is a predicament because you went back in good faith. Well, maybe good faith. Maybe good faith. But also you were being a little bit of a provocateur. You didn't, I'm sure you, to some extent, anticipated that this would stimulate something further, and that makes the whole recitation even more interesting, because now you have his responses, and he doesn't dare come back again, because then you'll publish that. But all that is, we're put in a very interesting situation vis-a-vis these ethical review committees, because now, is that legitimate, and, who's going to judge, and is this crossing a line? Well, in fact, I think we have to be free to analyze and to publish our material as best we can, and it can't be simply trying to say things that everybody will consensually nod and say, yes, that was wonderful. Then that's pablum anthropology. So I'm just sort of pointing out, I think, the predicament that you went right into and you still are going to grapple with, but that I think everybody going into the field has to anticipate, and the students in particular who are trying to be forthright and trying to be, see themselves on the morally good side of this, actually going too far by giving the power to the informants over whether they'll use material. And so we always have to sort of warn them and pull back.
Yeah, I have a last slide that I didn't show, which is an image of the inside of Monticello with a map of Africa. Okay. That interview was 1991, so it's a long time ago. But the map of Africa appeared in the mid-90s, and I just happened to see it when I was cruising the website. And so I tried to find out, why is that map of Africa there? Because it didn't fit with something else I was writing about Monticello as a museum, where that room is filled with Indian artifacts, and it shouldn't have Africa, and mastodons and so forth. It's a prototype of a natural history museum that Thomas Jefferson made. So I emailed him, because you're allowed to email questions, and said, I'm a professor, blah, blah, and I want to know when the map went up, and got back a response that said, it went up in the mid-90s, the curator decided to do it. Where did the map come from? Well, we bought it in an estate sale. Jefferson did own it, but we don't know where it hung. Well, why did you hang it there, right there? Silence. Email again, why did you hang it there? Silence. No, they don't want to tell me. Because, again, now I'm in the the journalist role, and they know that I know that they hung it there, probably because they want desperately, as Monticello and every site in the United States does, to be racially inclusive. And so they're wanting to put Africa into the imaginary. And so they're playing fast and loose with historical facts, which is fine by my view. I don't mind that. But what I do find fascinating is that they're not able to own up to that. They can't. So they always have this double quality of telling one story to the public and another one that gets hidden, kind of hidden archive. So back to your point, yes, when I have my students who are only undergraduates do their IRBs, which they have to do for practice, I always point out that most of anthropology is stuff in the public domain. It doesn't need to be vetted. It gets exempted from IRB scrutiny if you write it right, and it should be. And by the same token, yes, you need to. Our job is not to be moralists, and maybe this is what you were driving at yesterday. It's to get at something that we consider to be true, not something that we consider to be on the side of the good guys or against the bad guys. Because if we do that, we're always in trouble, because we don't quite know who the good guys or the bad guys are. Our job might, when I think of, again, back to the intertextuality thing, I like a writer like Philip Roth or Doris Lessing. I think that they're really good because they tend to say things that often offend or trouble the very people that they're supposed to be associated with, because they're trying to tell the truth. That's my view of what anthropology does too, is it tries to figure out what other people are thinking and feeling in order to get at something that's true. And it's a hard job, but it's not one that we can anticipate by saying, oh, the way to do that is to be on their team, or the way to do that is to help this cause. Because a lot of times, you know, to go back to what Blair's perfect example of that yesterday, the cause suddenly gets real murky, and you don't know whose team is the right one anymore, you know.
On the issue of individual attribution, though, you can sometimes, I usually can get around that on the basis that the bad news, or for that matter, the good news, doesn't necessarily have to be structured in the representation so that it's attributable to a person.
Yeah.
If it's really a pattern that's fairly, you know, widely distributed, you can do the pattern without necessarily saying, and so said. That won't help you now because you've got this.
Yeah, well, public figures are, when they're publicly...
When they're speaking in public, right?
Exactly, or when they agree to interviews, etc.
And remember that IRBs are basically attorneys protecting the institution of lawsuits.
Yeah.
I have to. I've asked people to. Johannes, did you indicate that you wanted to say something? Johannes Fabian?
I think I do.
Yeah. That's what I felt. This is intersubjectivity. I felt it, though you didn't have your hand up. So I'll give you the chance, and then Corinne, and then. Okay, please.
I've been sitting on this since yesterday. I wanted to make a statement about intersubjectivity. And the first thing I want to remind ourselves, when the concept was introduced in anthropology, not in philosophy, it was not a call for action. It was a concept that we hoped would enable us to get a critical view of what happens when we do field work. That is, what we were after was an intellectually responsible definition of the nature of our work, not a moral justification. It has its epistemology, it has, in my book, nothing to do as such. There are other things, but as such, it is an epistemological concept. So all these ways of speaking, I can't deny them, they are real. When someone says, we do it, the subjectivity, that makes no sense whatsoever to me, but it is spoken, it's a real sentence, it's pronounced now, so it must be a practice now. But for what it is worth, it makes no sense to me. Second, it was not introduced in a vacuum, just because we had fun doing epistemology. It was, as I said yesterday, introduced in a polemical situation, in a political situation. It was against an adversary. So who was the adversary? It was all those for whom that kind of problem was no problem, because they basically worked in a framework of natural history, of science, that another person was an object was for them no problem. For us, it began to be a problem. Was the second step. That was when intersubjectivity came. Next step, we then realized that more and more, that the way we relate to people, they are very complex. Knowing as anthropologists that we're totally caught up in our culture, we go to someone else totally caught up in their culture. How can we bridge this? That's when intersubjectivity came in. Because, again, as an assumption, if we don't assume such a thing as intersubjectivity, we should shut up. Nothing is going to happen. Everything we will do is delusional. We will just project ourselves into other cultures. So that's when the phenomenologists gave us the conceptual material in intersubjectivity. I'm getting fired up about this. But there's one or two more points. I already want, Bob, it might take 5 minutes. Then comes the other crucial realization that communication has one great difference, well, there's one great difference between communication as sort of the paradigm of our fieldwork as opposed to observation, right? Communication needs time. It needs time and timing. It needs time to occur, it needs time to be documented, and our work needs time to work with these documents. Hello. And now the last remark. Who is our adversary now? It used to be the positivists. It's all of those who don't give us time. And that sounds cryptic. It isn't cryptic at all. It's the big capital in search of meaning or purpose that funds our research and puts everything upside down. That is, they will, and this gets then filtered through the university administrations, you know this. So you're better off when you ask for $1 million than you ask for $10,000, which would be all you needed to do fantastic field work. This sounds a little bit naive, but I think this is this is the greatest danger. And that's, it's not capitalism, we are not in the business of righting the wrong of capitalism in the world. This is very practical. What are they doing to us? Do they give us the time to do things? In Holland it has gotten so perverse that when evaluations come, right? And evaluations are always about how much time did it take you to do something. You don't get points for books anymore. The only thing that counts is peer-reviewed, shitty articles.
That's crazy.
Published in shitty journals, reviewed by shitty peers. But that'll count. That'll count. A book won't count. No, who will be ever, except in by tenure and so on, you want to evaluate it on a book that took time and so on, but not in the research business. So I've said it. It's enough.
Thank you very much. It was very, very clarifying, and thank you. And just regarding the book, a young professor in Taiwan had her book accepted by Harvard University Press. It's coming out now in the spring. She says it doesn't count a bit in Taiwan, only articles count.
Yeah. That seems to be a worldwide thing.
Yeah.
I'm an
So,
author, but
we are
yeah.
And what you say about time is exactly the problem that is at the core of the so-called reform that the French government tries to implement regarding research in the social sciences. I mean, what will be accepted in the future are research projects for 3 years, full stop, and tenure for researcher will no longer be available. Only short-term contracts for short-term projects. And this is, I mean, you're right, this is the enemy. I mean, this is
And I think that the important
But the enemy is
thing that ethnography, the anthropologists do with the ethnography that a lot of other people do is precisely the time element.
It's not, yeah, right.
So we're going to have to keep the order of questions.
Some people have their hands up, and
This is an ongoing thread. I would let this go and then come back.
okay. Then I have requested. I unfortunately will have to leave at 12 because I give a lecture at 1 at McGill. So if you want to continue, then I will quietly withdraw, and you continue.
Let's do that. That way we won't
If
be late.
you do that, and then you fill me in when I come back.
I'll take over. Okay, so let's see. Can we come back to what? Right now we have, it's about 5 to 12. We're supposed to stop at noon, but I would suggest that we continue for 5 or 10 minutes because I feel like there's a bit of a buzz going on. So, Alberta, what were you saying?
I just wanted to distinguish that I think that the time element is right on, that the difference between, you had mentioned other ethnographic disciplines, the big difference is time. I mean, we take 1 year, 1.5 years. Journalists that are doing like a book report, they don't take that amount of time. There's a certain kind of
Yeah, I think the telling elements was distinguished anthropological ethnographic work, and then what everybody's been mentioning is that the recursive, that we go back to the same problems and the same communities and the same people.
I think it might be more recursive than time, but we could talk. I mean, it's easy for us anthropologists to talk about time and how time is so important because that's really kind of this is our griping session, right? But I think the recursive is more important than just the length or the, you know what I mean?
Both.
There's the nature of it. Okay, both. Pascal.
Just in a completely different direction, but something that the discussion between Eric and John brought to me is the issue of voice. And we were asking a little bit earlier about, what does intersubjectivity bring us? And speaking as a PhD student, I want to point out maybe a bit of a risk of intersubjectivity, because when you teach me about intersubjectivity, you're worried about me not losing track of the voice of these other people that I'm in contact with during my fieldwork. And certainly that's important. On the other hand, there's historians finding the voice of people through inquisitorial transcripts from the 15th century, and they find the voice of the people put on trial. So do we need to be... Well, I don't know. One danger is I also need, as a PhD student, to find my voice. And I need to be helped to find my own voice in my own writing. And I think it's important in teaching PhD students that we not forget about that. And Gertz's analysis on Evans Pritchard and how he establishes his ethnographic authority, that's very useful. But I don't know, are there that many classes about the poetics of anthropology and anthropological writing and techniques of anthropological writing? I don't know, that's important, that's my voice, as an author. The other thing I wanted to mention, again from a PhD point of view, is John talked about the never-ending field, and I think that's true, and I'm continuing my research from my master's as part of my PhD, but that's kind of an odd fit right now, because I'm not supposed to be doing research. I don't have an ethics certificate. I have a musician an African musician who lives in Europe who's coming next week that I'm bringing to teach workshops in Montreal. Is that fieldwork? Is it not fieldwork? Oh, I don't really know, actually. But it's kind of my field, but really it's taking away from my academic work, because it's time I'm spending with this guy. I'm not doing this other stuff that is the prerequisites for my PhD. It's tough, and I'm not sure the PhD structure is really adapted to the never-ending field structure.
Especially because universities are trying to push people to condense scholarity.
Yeah, I had my hand up before Johannes. We've sort of gone somewhere else. But what I had been going to say was, went back to something that Eric said, which I've now forgotten. One thing I appreciated about the papers this morning was that I felt like we're getting stuck on intersubjectivity, which in some ways is just most basically a kind of communicative connection that lets researchers engage with and learn and exchange and communicate with others. And I thought that the papers this morning were sort of pushing us on to what's actually the title. How does anthropology know and the co-production of knowledge? And sort of, I felt like we're getting hung up with, and we'll keep circling back to it, but we keep getting hung up on intersubjectivity and what it is, and may or may not be moral mutuality. And as I said to Bob last night, some of the ways we're talking about it reminds me of some of the ways that all of the sort of buzz about agency gets talked about, where people talk about agency as a personal possession. It's sort of like, I have intersubjectivity. And so, I'm sort of, glad that we're kind of pushing on a little bit, even if we keep circling back to it.
Well, Loki and Kak.
So again, another take. 2 or 3 reactions, One is to what Uni was saying about the relation between silence and spoken word, and the comments he made about the gender tag. So as you know, the power of ethnography is that Ruth Benedict, my predecessor to Zuni, in her Patterns of Culture, which is more popular than any other book written by a social scientist, dead or alive, says that the Zunis really don't understand sex, And the evidences he produced was that the origin myths he had collected from one of the Zunis, when he was talking to her, it was a man, Kroeber called him the greatest intellectual among the Native Americans, was completely silent about sex. And they had no problem talking about sex with me. And I wrote it to Ruth Bunzel, that is there a problem here, because what was going on? And Ruth Bunzel said, I'm glad she was alive. She said that, look, the problem is that Ruth Benedict, really did not know the language. He spent just 4 months in the Pueblo, did not understand what was going on. She was just working with 2 old people, and collected everything which they had narrated, and then got Flora Zuni to translate. So, in a way, she said that I collected the same origin myth and compared it with what Cushing had collected, and the line which was missing was the boy took the girl in the corral and had sex with her. So here again, the Zuni man is speaking in Zuni to a white woman, could not bring himself, even though he knew that she did not understand what he was saying, to talk about sex to a white woman. The gender talk about sex is of a very different kind. So in a way, in my younger days, there was no way that I can ask my informant Flora Zuni, who was like a mother to me, any question about gender, any question about sex. Son does not ask the mother about sex or sexuality. So to some extent, the very fact that these matters were there, and then the theories about gender and sexuality and all that started to emerge, I as an ethnographer can really see what was going on. The other example which I wanted to give is the wonderful thing which Professor Fabian said about language yesterday, that I have to put up with the burden of my predecessors to Zuni, beginning with Frank Hamilton Cushing. So Cushing, in his adventures at Zuni, said, that after sketching a kachina, he goes and addresses one of the Zunis he saw as Kihe, and then he talks about, and Kihe in parentheses, he says friend. So I thought that was the Zuni word for friend. So I will talk to my friends and I will also address as Kihe, and they will absolutely freeze. I didn't know what it meant, but I saw their reaction. They will absolutely freeze. And then after 2 or 3 months, I turned to one of them and said, whenever I use this term, why people freeze? And they said, look, you don't know. We are not dead yet. We are living. So I said, what do you mean? So they said, what do you want to say? So I said, I want to say friend. Say that the friend is Kue, not Kihe. So I said, what is Kihe then? So they said, that is the dead people when they become kachinas, spiritually they address to each other as Kihe. In this world we are Kue, other world we are Kihe. I didn't know that. So again, that helped me to understand what was really going on. The last comment I want to make is to what John was saying, and back to Mayor Fortis's apartment in London. So what you said, that the lineage theory and the Bedouin connection, you said, So Evans Pritchard had done his field work in Africa. He really did not know how to interpret it. This is Mayor Fortis speaking now. And he has also now narrated that in his essay in Annual Review in Anthropology in 1978. So he said that Radcliffe Brown had come to London to attend the British Academy meetings, and Fortis took him to his apartment. And Fortis and Evans Pritchard had a kind of fraternal bond. Evans Pritchard was just 4 years older than my Fortis, and was his protector. So he really helped him. So he said that RB pontificated about the Greek society and the French society and all these clan-based and lineage-based societies in Europe, and then he turned to EP and said, EP, why don't you use it as a model to analyze your newer material? So he said that, look, when there was antagonism between the two of them, because Evans Pritchard thought that rightfully he should have succeeded, he should have become the first professor of social anthropology at Oxford, not Radcliffe Brown, who was a Cambridge man and more or less an outsider. EP was the Oxford man, but Malinowski did not support Evans Pritchard for the chair at Oxford. He supported RB, Radcliffe Brown. So Radcliffe Brown got the chair, and EP never forgave Radcliffe Brown and Malinowski for that. So to some extent, the stance he took about the humanistic view of anthropology versus the Radcliffe Brownian scientific one was precisely because of that. So.
No, I'll pass. I'll keep it for tomorrow.
Okay. Amazing patience.
I mean, it has to do with shyness and so on.
There was another comment in the back. Okay.
I have two questions, I guess. Listening to John and Eric talk, maybe I had an impression that there was more of a conflict than you guys have been, discussing so far. And one of the conflicts that I saw was John talked about the mystery, and my question is, what's the idea of the relationship between mystery and knowledge? Mystery seems to be like something very much against knowledge. And Eric talked about how the purpose of anthropological research is about getting understanding the other in totality. And John says, well, the other is mystery. So I thought maybe I would like to hear you guys tell me whether it's a conflict or if you agree with each other in some sense. The other is, I guess, continuing that with the question to John. John focused on speaking, but you do end up, sometimes anthropologists do write. So how do you write this mysteriousness of the other when you're writing? And the second question is I wasn't sure, Monticello, is that a real place or is it like
Very real.
But it's a real place, but you're using it as an example because, right? To convey your point, you're making a point, you have a theoretical point and you're using this as an example. And my first question is why don't you just change the name so that it doesn't become like an expose done in journalism? I think, once again, in relation to what John was talking about, he was talking about Levinas, and Levinas is kind of against this, the particulars becoming examples of the general theory, and he's very critical about that aspect of, and it seems like it's the moment when the intersubjectivity gets lost and becomes this, Levinas calls it ecology, but it becomes the subjective moment rather than intersubjective.
One really quick response about, I thought he was quoting Levinas for saying that about the mystery. So he was talking about how, at least my sense of what you were doing was to say that it's not always, anybody you meet, there's always something you don't quite know, and so that's curiosity provoking, etc. I'd agree with that. I mean, that's what a conversation with anybody always creates. But I guess what I was just saying was that I was drawn to anthropology and still am because I am curious about what other people think and feel, and I do want to try to make sense of why they think and feel that way. What is that larger context for how they think and feel? And so I'm more interested in how they think and feel than how I think and feel. But by the same token, as many people have pointed out here, we are an instrument. And so how we interact with another person does affect what we think we know about that other person or that other place, etc. And so at base, intersubjectivity is about that dilemma, that the instrument of understanding is the moment of an encounter. And so that can be taken as a given. The other question, though, about Monticello is that Monticello is the home of Thomas Jefferson. It would be impossible to write about Thomas Jefferson and then say it's the home of a man by the name of T. You know, yeah, you know, or you know, and it wouldn't make it not interesting. So Monticello has to be about Monticello.
No, but also you couldn't do this.
Yeah, it just wouldn't work. So in general, our desire to hide the identities of people often runs aground against our need to use their identities to make sense of things. So there's always a balancing act there. How much you hide that identity, how much is that identity what you're talking about? So it depends on the site and so forth.
Thomas Jefferson can run, but he can't hide. Okay, we should stop for lunch. Thank you very much for